So moving next into our agenda, we are going to hear updates on school budgets. We have more witnesses than usual today because this is the week after town meeting break, and so we're going to also talk to the Superintendent's Association, School Boards Association. Before that, Sean, would you like to join us and give us your standard update?
Sure.
Thank you. And I believe this is posted on our committee pages as well, folks.
Do you want me to share today?
That would be delightful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon. I'm Sean Kuzno from the Agency of Education. I'm the interim CFO. I'll try to speak louder this time. Thanks for having me in. So on the screen we have just an update on what I've been sharing over the last couple of weeks. We have most of the budgets in for their preliminary, our preliminary collection. So 1.9 billion spending in the 115 that have submitted. We're using previous estimates for 4 districts. The largest one there is Essex, who they vote later, I think in April. So they haven't submitted a board-approved budget yet. And then there's the 3 Gores and unorganized towns are the 3 at the bottom with only a few ADM there. And let's see, so our increase over last year in net spending is down a little bit from last time I came in at 5.83%. So 109.55 million over last year at this point. So we're down. I got 2.3 million from the last time I was in here. And let's see, I've listed the districts in over the spending threshold. I believe those are the same ones as we talked about last time. I did try to answer a few of the questions that came in, and we'll continue on to those. Well, I have the failed budgets and the ed spending figures, the percent change over last year, and the long-term ADM, weighted ADM counts. So I believe there are 9 there. And I thank the School Boards Association for sharing that data with us. Let's see. And I think someone asked, how are people, how are districts by size keeping either spending more or less? And I just shared here a few different categories and the number of districts that are keeping it below 5% and above 5%. Just a random number I picked. So it's pretty mixed. The smallest ones, most of them are keeping it under 5%, and the others, it's a mixed bag on if they're keeping their spending under a 5% increase. And for the ones in excess spending, the question was asked, are there long-term weighted ADMs going down? And comparing 25 to the 26 number, all but one, yes, and some of them go down a decent amount, so that may be driving why they're in the excess. And,
Why are they orange?
sorry. They're unions. They're just carryovers,
Thank you.
from our spreadsheets.
Okay.
And that's what I have for today.
Thanks. Any questions from anyone?
Yeah, so this is a lot of information to us all at once. What are the takeaways? What are the 2 biggest points here you want us to remember?
I mean, I think the overall spending is, still right around where everyone thought it would be,
Okay.
with some final Well, now we have a lot of voted, approved budgets, so we'll collect the final budgets in June. Or maybe we're doing it earlier this year, so we may be able to start sharing our
So are
final.
you thinking the few schools who had a defeated budget, my district is one to be fair, did not have to do with the spending, it had perhaps another issue? Is that what you're saying? Or
They may not be in the excess spending, but yeah, I guess their increase over last year was more, I guess, than the voters wanted.
thank you.
Mhm.
Just noticed that the relationship between the district's in excess spending and the failed school budgets, there is no relationship. And then just the question, even though those school districts that are in excess, they've cut their spending except for one, and they still are in excess, over the excess spending threshold.
I don't know if they cut their spending. Their long-term weighted ADM has gone down,
Fair
which
enough. Yeah.
creates a higher per pupil if they don't cut their spending.
Thank you, right, I was reading that chart wrong, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the long-term weighting went down, but the still.
Yeah. Yeah.
On that same point, I'm curious, you maybe don't have the answer to this, but would you reflect on prior to Act 118 with the pupil weight changes, is this abnormal for the number of districts that hit the excess spending threshold, or was it historically about 8 to 9 communities that were also affected by pupil changes, as there seems to be a relationship with the weighted pupil counts?
Right, yeah. How long has the excess spending been?
We suspended it for 1 year last year.
Oh, just the 1 year?
We
Okay.
suspended it for most of the pandemic, and it's back in,
So it's
this is
been a
the
while?
first year it's been
Yeah.
back.
Okay, I'd have to look back, yeah.
And relatedly, I guess I'm wondering if the census is this bad policy that the excess spending threshold likely triggers when weighted pupil counts decline, or is that what we effectively want to have accomplished? Weighted pupils are declining. Do we want to have that spending threshold drive down spending?
You're looking at me,
Yeah, I'm
Senator?
looking at you.
I think it can be, it can go both ways. I mean, sometimes it's driven by the fact that there are fewer pupils, and so the per pupil spending is going to go up, and whether or not that is fair to trigger or not. I mean, certainly if you ask the school boards, they may say, hey, this is nothing we've done, this is not our fault. And there's a difference between marginal and absolute changes too. And sometimes when you're looking at the marginal changes, you can't change your class sizes if 1 or 2 kids leave per grade. So this is sort of the constant problem for school districts with declining enrollment, is that it's not all in one grade or all in one program or all in one school building. It's sort of layered across the district. But another point I would just say is the districts that whose budgets failed, I believe most of them are districts that often have their budgets fail. That at least for sure, the one in my district is always sort of battling budget failure. So we're sort of back to the same kind of pattern that we saw last year was actually the blip. And now we're sort of back to the way it had been before.
And I imagine when Chelsea and Sue come speak with us, that would be something that would be a big part of the conversation we have with them just a second. Any other questions? Yeah?
Thanks so much for coming in. Do you at this point have any ability to assess what big drivers of increased costs are? And with that, do you also have any sense of to what extent districts used reserves to buy down locally?
Yes.
And do you also have information on bonds? Sure.
Probably not. Well, maybe bonds. We started to look at reserves, but I ran out of time. We should be able to see some of that. And then the drivers, yeah, we do have more detailed data this year for, I think, the majority of districts. So we can work on that between now and next time.
It'd be great to see the the 10 biggest in total dollar value, but maybe also as a percent change. And with respect to bonds, it'd be interesting to know who approved a bond and to what extent that is now, what's that in the ed fund right now?
Okay.
Costing us.
Thank you, Sean, for
Yeah.
this. It's great. I looked at the list of failed budgets, and I didn't have a chance to go through each one, but I know a few of them are sending districts and don't have high schools. Do you know if there's a correlation between failed budgets and whether or not they send their students out or not?
Yeah.
We know Georgia and Auburn.
Albert. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
And maybe so that Chelsea can answer.
John, I've got a question on, so the districts with excess spending, you showed J here. J and Westfield are a combined school. Is J only here because of the number of students from J?
Yeah. Yeah. They do a separate budget. The school is a joint school, I guess. But,
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Thank you very much, Sean. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.
Chelsea and Sue, do you want to come up together or separately?
Together.
There are two chairs. They're awkwardly aligned, but you're welcome to move them around. Thanks for all your work to always promptly track all of this.
I have to give immense credit to our office manager, Christy Tate, who you don't see here. She works from very early in the morning on town meeting day until the end of the day and does a lot of the legwork. So thank you to Christy. For the record, Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
And Sue Siklowski, Executive Director for the Vermont School Boards Association.
Voters approved over 90% or 104 school budgets on town meeting day, demonstrating a show of public support for Vermont education. 9 school budgets were defeated, which is a more typical result than the defeats of FY25. Vermont has 56 supervisory districts and supervisory unions and 124 school budgets to support them. In this year's March votes on Tuesday's town meeting day and the previous days, 113 budgets were voted upon. These range from small towns like Holland to the state's largest cities, Burlington, Rutland, and South Burlington. 11 budgets will be voted on between March 10th and May 13th, including the Essex Westford School District on April 8th. You'll find a link below about the live spreadsheet results in our testimony, and as those additional budgets that are being voted on later, we'll update that spreadsheet for you all. Out of the 9 defeated budgets, 5 have a history of prior budget defeats exclusive of FY25. So that's Alberg, Georgia, Slate Valley, Springfield, and Wolcott. 3 were defeated last year alone: Fairfax, Ludlow, Mount Holly, and Payne Mountain. And 1 does not have a history of a budget defeat in the past 10 years. So we looked at budget results from the last 10 years of who were defeated. And so 5 out of the 9 have a pretty common history of being defeated, and the other 4 not as much.
I'll talk a little bit now about one of the factors that goes into school district budgets, which is the cost of health insurance premiums. And of course, those are included in school district budgets and paid for by Vermont taxpayers. The cost of public school employees' health insurance exceeds $300 million per year, and the cost increased by 16% in FY25 and 12% in FY26. And we just wanted to point out that these costs are consuming a larger and larger portion of Vermont school budgets. In 2018, the health benefits made up less than 10% of school budgets. They're now at 15%, and if the growth continues at the current rate, in a few years, they'll be at 20% of school district budgets. So To deal with the issue, school boards have to hold the line on the remaining parts of the budget, and this means that healthcare is squeezing out other education initiatives. With projected education spending at 6.4%, it's clear that healthcare is squeezing out other education initiatives because of course, the healthcare increase was 12%. School administrators and school boards got to work considerably earlier this year for budgeting. In August, our associations, along with the Vermont Association of School Business Officials, released a budgeting memo, and I've included a link to that budgeting memo in our written testimony to support their early planning efforts, and they really did take that to heart and start very early. School leaders made challenging decisions with their communities to best support students and taxpayers, with some deciding to make significant staffing changes.
And then on the second page of our testimony, you can see kind of the summary of results from town meeting day, and linked in there again is the live spreadsheet results, which will be updated as we get more information.
What role do you see, because this year was definitely, sea change from last year's budget votes. But the governor promised early on that he was going to buy down the tax rate. Do you see that as having impacted school votes at all?
From the majority of conversations that I had with superintendents, because they knew it was not a guarantee, they did not factor that into their planning process.
No, they didn't. I'm wondering.
Oh, but the voters did. I don't know.
I don't think it's ever been in doubt that Vermonters support their schools.
Yeah.
It's last year.
What I will say
is it got to be unaffordable. And this year is an addition on to last year's unaffordable. And just about all of them passed. And I'm wondering if, I think most people take the governor at his word. If he said he would buy down your tax increase, then I'm sure that had an influence on some voters. I just didn't know if anyone knew how much.
no, other than the fact that looking at the communication strategies locally for budgets, they were not advertising that very strongly. So it would be just from the state level reporting of that. They were not using that in their communication strategies.
That's good to know. Yeah. We got another.
The budgets that are scheduled at a later date, I don't know this. Is that, like, do they always vote, do these districts, the 11, do they always vote later, or were they trying to wait out the legislature to see if they would know more about governance changes, or?
Little of both, I think. Well, last year, some of them changed to a later date for reasons related to Act 127, for example, and I think some of them stayed within that trend, but we typically see around 8 to 11 or so voting at a later date. And some of them are always voting at a later date, and some of them kind of go on and off that list. Is that?
Yes, correct.
And can I follow? In my district and in some of my neighboring, I mean, Barry, we just passed our school budget on the first time in recent memory. Yes, but it's also not a great budget. It's a budget that relies on, making permanent vacancy savings. There are other neighboring districts that are doing layoffs to pass their budget, and we know that that's not going to improve student outcomes. So I'm curious as to whether you're hearing from your members that what we're doing is still not sustainable, and without addressing healthcare costs, there's really nothing they can do to significantly bring down the cost of education without negatively impacting student outcomes.
I think that healthcare costs do weigh heavily on them. I hear from the school boards very frequently about that. Yes.
I will add that in talking with superintendents, and of course this is just anecdotal, that like kind of the first year that budgets were really tough, like last year, they were choosing not to fill already vacant positions, and that this year they're even less able to do that. So they're talking about real positions and real people. And then if we were to go into another year of this with dramatically increased health insurance costs, that they would be really pulling into more jobs at that point. Yeah, so the kind of the vacant positions are pretty much removed at this point. Yeah.
I'm curious if the budgets that passed assume sort of current law status, including universal school meals.
I would think yes.
Can you take the question one more time?
Yeah, did the budgets that were warned and passed assume that universal school meals would still be in place in the next fiscal year?
I would assume so, but I don't know with certainty.
Okay.
I know some of them are talking, one of the big questions right now that's coming across my desk is what people are doing related to the federal situation around positions that are federally funded.
And what are people doing?
It's varies. I can get you more information, but we're just kind of really digging into that question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
It would be great to hear more about that as well.
I'm doing an update in Homestead, I think, on Thursday about that, and I'll include that. Yeah.
Do you have a sense to what degree did the school districts convey what the actual impact is on the tax rates? And if they did, what yield were they using in terms of calculating that tax rate?
They use the yield that is like most current with when they warn their budgets. And yes, I think that it benefits them to convey the tax rate implications because the per pupil percent increase is actually less stable. So it was included on the ballot. That was one thing we heard frequently from superintendents is that the ed spending percent increase could have gone up tremendously, like in the 10% range, but tax rates were still going down. So they really had to communicate accurately what the town by town percent increase or decrease was because of that kind of instability in the percent increase because of some of the changes related to long-term weighted ADM. Some were hit pretty drastically by changes in the poverty weights. And so they were highly communicating what the tax rate implications were from town to town.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the yield, because there were several different versions throughout the fall and then right until last, so when the budgets were firmed up by the school boards, was it a December figure they were using from AOE? Was it what were they using?
I could pull up the ed funding and see what the number was, if that's helpful, while Sue talks.
Yeah, I think that it varies from district to district. Some of them will rely on the December letter number, and others will use an updated number.
Okay.
But they try to be as I would say conservative as they can, so not to show a lower tax rate than they expect.
Okay. And I'm asking because we're at the point of setting the yield, so trying to meet voters' expectations.
They did, I'm pretty sure that the majority of them, like I said, did not use the buy down yield. They used not the December 1 letter, but like a couple, maybe like the second one after that I send out the ed fund outlooks to superintendents pretty frequently. So whichever one was closest to, when do they warn their budgets?
In January.
In January, yeah. So the one closest to January.
Okay, thank you. Helps.
Thank you for coming in and for all your work. I heard concerns from our local boards about the long-term weighted ADM, and one district even put on the slide that they've been compelled to validate the long-term weighted ADM, but they knew the number was incorrect. Are you hearing concerns about data?
Yeah.
And what are the nature of those concerns?
There was a lot of back and forth between the long-term weighted ADM data reporting. It's a pretty clunky process, and I would say to the AOE's credit, it has been in years past as well, so it's not just unique to this year. But they have started a new validation process for long-term weighted ADM, and I think that I'd feel more comfortable if you asked the Agency of Education about that.
process.
Thank you for coming and for all your hard work. It's a challenging time for sure. I think a lot of our questions are around like voter. We're trying to understand voter attitude and behavior. And I remember, I think it was last election cycle, it seemed like a lot of the budgets that went down were associated with districts that had consolidated, if I'm not mistaken. And so just getting back to my previous question, I'm concerned about, or would like to know more about the budgets that failed. Are a lot of those are more than two? I know two are districts that don't have a high school and send students out, because we are potentially contemplating some pretty serious consolidation and, changes in our system. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that at all.
By my count, it's a little more than half that are tuitioning districts.
Thanks, yeah, just
Heard some examples from budgeting, just like last year, where tuition is tuition. And so what happens is that you end up having to make considerable cuts in the schools that you do operate in, because there's not a whole lot of control around tuitioning.
Anyone else? Thank you both for all your work.
Thank you.
You're on committee day right now. Julia.
Yeah.
I have a slightly weird public service announcement while Julia's coming up. So the usual process for setting the yield is not something we do in a joint committee. But we've been sort of looking at the outlook as a joint committee, and the way generally we move towards numbers on a yield bill is the chair works with JFO to sort of come up with a few different scenarios, and people on the committee react in various ways to the various scenarios, and we sort of start narrowing from there. There's not been a lot of reacting yet this year, and we need to set the yield in the next 2 weeks. So I'm just sort of encouraging people to feel more engaged in this, and if House members would rather do it without the Senate around, we'll schedule more testimony, or if you just need me to say, please have more opinions, I don't know. But just sort of wanted to add that as a public service announcement. This is fun chance for senators to help set the yield before it gets to you.
I think it'd be fun to watch how sausage making is done in
Yeah.
the other body.
So I don't know if usually Senator Beck has much more opinions when he was a rep, and it's the absence of you that's confusing me this year. I really don't know, but Julie and I were reflecting on how it just sort of feels slightly different. Maybe it's just we're all thinking like far into the future and we're not like sitting in the now. Yes, but we still have this year and FY26, so yes. The floor is yours. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. I'm Julia Richter with JFO. So there's one document on the committee, both committee pages under my name, that has a lot of columns that the chair asked me to put together in terms of what different ways to thinking about setting the yield. I know it's a lot of numbers on a small page, but so I have that. I also have a couple of comments about some of the questions that you all just had that I would also be happy to address. Is there a preference?
I would love if you started with sort of, I think there were lingering fact questions when we were taking previous testimony. One about sort of the timeline around the excess spending thresholds and bonding related to the excess spending threshold, if you want to clarify any of that.
Sure. Yeah. So with respect to the excess spending threshold, you all will recall that essentially what this is it was put back into play in the yield bill last year. And what it does is it looks at a district's per pupil spending for the upcoming fiscal year, so for fiscal year 26, and it compares it against the prior, against FY25's average per pupil spending multiplied by 118%. The piece that I wanted to remind, or there were actually a couple of pieces I wanted to remind both committees about. One is that included in that reinstatement of the excess spending threshold last year all exemptions and exclusions were done away with for the excess spending threshold, with the exception of one. And the one that remained, or I guess was added, was for all bond principal and interest payments on bonds that were approved prior to July 1st, 2024. So I'm raising that because I know that there were some questions about how do bonds fit into excess spending and into the education spending results that we're looking at here. And I wanted to flag, it depends on when the bond passed, right? Because if the bond was passed prior to July 1st of 2024, then those P&I payments are going to be excluded for the purpose of calculating excess spending, not for the purpose of calculating education spending in general. There are a couple other pieces that make it challenging to compare excess spending penalty districts now to prior years. One is what we just spoke about, the repeal of all of those exclusions and exemptions, but also the basis upon which we're measuring what is considered excess spending was also changed. So before it was being compared to fiscal year 2015, now it's being compared to fiscal year 2025. In between 2015 and 2025, there's a lot of policy changes that have happened. And also the percentage that was used to calculate the excess spending threshold was changed. So now it's that 118%. So that was just a little bit of background that I thought would be helpful when thinking about the excess spending threshold. And then one other piece, shall I continue in my notes of things that I wanted to share? Another piece that I thought would be helpful to mention, just you all probably know this, but for it to be said out loud, that all of these, this 5.8 or 5.5% increase in education spending is talking about one piece of a multifaceted puzzle, right? We're not talking about the change in spending on education. We're talking about that technical education spending, which is a school district budget minus all of its offsetting revenues. So we're looking at a change to the prior year, so that's a 5.8% increase on top of whatever it was last year. And we're not looking at overall, when we're talking about education spending growth, we're not looking at overall budget growth. We're looking at education spending growth. And those pieces that impact education spending are going to be your categorical aid, your offsetting revenues, if a school district is or is not pulling from reserves, if they did or did not pull from reserves in the prior year. So there's a lot of pieces that are not explicitly, but are being reflected in that one single number that I just wanted to flag.
And then the spending on education writ large across the state that is not education spending, around, do you have a sense of at sort of what rate that's been growing?
Not off the top of my head, but I certainly could. I know I put it together. It is reflected, the spending on education, if we're looking at it solely from the state level, is going to be reflected in our total uses line of the education fund outlook. However, we know that there have been fluxes in federal funds coming to the state on education. I'm thinking of ESSER dollars, for instance. So depending if we're thinking about solely state dollars on education versus state and federal dollars on education, it'll be a different answer. But I would be happy to prepare something for the committee if that would be helpful.
Madam Chair, and to that degree, as Representative Holcomb was asking, if there are some school districts that were using the reserves. So if you're talking about total spending, is there any way to capture what they're pulling from the reserves to actually support the spending as well? Because it's not going to affect the education payment on that, right?
Yeah, that would be a question for AOE in terms of if they could pull out that granular level of detail.
Okay.
And Julia, I don't know if you want to answer this now, but I always thought that the tuition for towns that were tuitioning out their high school kids, for example, or 6 to 12, that amount they had to pay was fairly well regulated, that it couldn't be more than the actual cost of educating those kids. I mean, there's almost a hint that these schools are charging whatever they want to charge to make money on the kids that are tuitioning in. Is that true? Has that changed a lot?
I am not prepared to speak to the. Let me take a step back. If we're talking about regulation or what's actually put in statute in terms of how tuition rates were set, I would need to phone a friend at Ledge Council because they would be able to speak to that in more detail. I will say that my understanding is that there are certain stipulations for tuition setting, and there can be a local vote as well to pay more in tuition than what is stipulated. But in terms of how that shakes out in the data that you've been looking at so far, I don't know.
I would love to have that information. If you can just tell me where to find it or who to talk to.
Yes. Absolutely.
And we can have Donna and Beth in to talk about that a little bit too.
Terrific. Okay.
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 Are those all the?
I have one other sort of
Okay.
tangential piece, if this is helpful. Okay, the final thing I wanted to say before getting into all of the different ways of modeling the ed spending and all of the different iterations in the Ed Fund Outlook is there was a question or two last time about the variance in per pupil spending that we were seeing across districts. So you'll recall that the yield bill last year required that the Department of Taxes in the December 1 letter publishes the variation in per pupil spending for the prior fiscal year. So I wanted to just bring that back to you in follow-up to our last meeting. So the data that was shared with me last night that Sean presented today, we see the lowest per pupil spending, and you'll recall that per pupil spending, that's that education spending, which is our technical term, the budget minus offsetting revenues, divided by the district's long-term weighted average daily membership. So it's weighted pupil count. So that lowest district, we're seeing a per pupil spending of $9,130. And the highest per pupil spending that we're seeing in the data right now is $18,023.
Can you tell us?
Double.
Can you tell us what those two districts are?
I can follow up on that.
And can you confirm whether the 9,000 is an elementary district?
Yeah, I'll need
versus
it.
a high school district of the 18?
Yes.
I would love to see that box plot, just seeing where the median is, how many are in that quarter there, and then if we also have a size weight for the number of pupils for each. So if I could just get that raw data, I'd love to just look at it.
I would be happy to. My hesitancy is that it was data shared with me by the Agency of Education. So before going, I just need to check with my colleague at AOE to make sure that everything I'm sharing, I'm allowed to be sharing. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I recall seeing past charts that showed the cost per pupil by district and looked at things such as the top 5 and the lowest 5, but also added to it those districts' scores on standardized tests for pupils. And I recall a number of situations that I can remember about some specific districts that had very low per pupil spending and among the highest in the state performance.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if those statistics exist today so we can see some charting of that.
Let me follow up with AOE to try to get, I don't have the test score data at my fingertips, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
I know the commission has seen a chart, not with names, but high performing, low spending, low performing,
I saw some
high spending.
with names as
Yeah,
well.
there's a lot of little colored circles on that. And I actually have asked the commissioner if she could put that into writing, because just looking at the chart without names doesn't tell you a whole lot. I'm hoping they have.
just respectfully repeat again that we be very clear what grade level we're talking about each of those districts and also what the poverty ratio is for each of those districts as well, or the data is meaningless. And we'll just reconfirm all our biases.
Let's talk about the outlook.
Okay. So there's an Ed Fund Outlook posted on the committee page, both committee pages under my name. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different scenarios here. Before diving into what each of the columns mean, I just will mention that the data reflects the latest data update that I've done since the last time that you saw it was this updated school budget data that I received on March 10th. Beyond that, all of the other data updates that we've talked about in previous meetings hold true here. So centering ourselves, we know column A, this is what each line reflects. I've zoomed it in. Tell me if I should zoom in more or zoom out. I don't really know the best way to do this with so many columns, but
I think a lot of people are zooming in on their own devices.
Okay.
And that seems like the right size for eyes. You can hack.
okay. So columns B and C, no change from when we last looked at this. We've got the BAA and the December 1 letter. The first column, this is the same parameters of column D that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. So to remind you all, what that means is we've updated the data with the latest school budget data, and then we solve for the non-homestead rate and the two yields, the income and homestead yield, for a uniform average bill change. What we see here, we see those average rates, the non-homestead rate, and the yields reflected here in the top, and then we see the corresponding uniform bill change of estimated to be 5.8%, given the data that we have available at the moment. The next modeling exercise follows the same parameters that I presented also last time with column E. What we're doing here is still the same data updates and still solving for a uniform average bill change across all three classes. The difference now is we've included a one-time general fund transfer of $77.2 million, which was included in the governor's recommended budget. We see that with that one-time $77.2 million general fund transfer and a uniform average bill change is estimated to be 1.1%. Shall I?
Yes.
Okay. The next column is also the same column F as a couple weeks ago. So we've got our data updates. We have the $77.2 million from the general fund still being transferred to the education fund. The difference here is that we have solved for an average bill change for homestead and income to 0%. We have not used that $77.2 million to buy down the non-homestead rate at all. Instead, what's not needed to buy down the homestead and income to 0 is put in a transformation transition reserve here at the bottom, so $33 million.
That's F, column F.
Column F, yes. Column, I'm gonna keep going unless I'm stopped for questions. Column G, this is saying, okay, we're gonna transfer the $77.2 million from the general fund to the education fund, but we're only gonna use half of it this year to buy down rates. So we're gonna use that half to buy down rates uniformly. So that would be a uniform buy down to an average bill change of 3.5%. And the other half of that $77.2 million would be put into a transition reserve.
And folks, just a reminder that whenever we buy down rates with one-time money, we wind up with a identical cliff the following year.
So I recall last year we did exhaust a couple of reserves. We had some money. Was that anywhere near 33 million? How much did we pull from reserves last year to make the yield bill?
So last year, there was 69 million in one time that was used to buy down the rates. In terms of what of that was coming from a reserve, it was 13 million. So in fiscal year, so that's reflected here in our 2025 column. You'll recall that in fiscal year 2024, there was a significant surplus, and so 13 million of that surplus was put into what was titled the tax rate offset reserve. In fiscal year 25, the General Assembly unreserved that 13 million and used it to uniformly buy down rates. The other one-time money was your one-time transfer from the general fund of 25 million, and also your 31 million of prior year unreserved, unallocated. There was also further money added to the education fund, but that wasn't one-time money because that was the repeal on the on the exemption for cloud tax and on the short-term rental surcharge, which has been, the cloud tax is reflected in the sales and use tax line 3, and our short-term rental surcharge, the short-term rental surcharge that was added last year is reflected in the meals and rooms line.
Let's do another column.
Okay, I think that this is actually the final column that I prepared for today, column H. So column G, you'll recall that it has, assuming the 77.2 million transferred to the general fund, and then half of that is being used to buy down rates, the other half is going into a reserve. Column H follows that construct, but says taking half of the 77.2 million from the general fund and putting it into a transition reserve. The remaining of that general fund money is used to uniformly buy down tax rates, right? That's what we did in column G. Column H says, okay, similar to the construct that was used last year, where there was the one-time increase in the property tax credit that corresponded with the average bill change. Here, we're increasing the property tax credit by the corresponding 3.5% that Homestead is estimated to increase. And the cost of that 5.2 million of the increase in the property tax credit is being raised by the non-homestead rate, which is why we see that the average bill change for the non-homestead to increase to 4%.
So there are pros and cons to all of these. Does anyone have any ideas on any pro? None of them are perfect because the Ed Fund is not perfect. Does anyone have any pros and cons they want to throw on the table? Folks want to stare at the Ed Fund in private, at the outlook in private with a magnifying glass later, and then talk about it tomorrow. Yes.
Well, I do think putting some money aside for a transition reserve is a good idea. We've been talking a lot about that. Facilities costs, for example, are not really accounted for anywhere in the transformation proposal. I think we have to have a lot more conversation about what specifically that money would be used for. We also have the $4 million that AOE is asking for to do some of this work. So I like the concept and just a lot more conversation about what we end up using it for. And I think on the property tax credit, I have mixed feelings about another one-time property tax credit increase because I feel like it just elongates an existing problem that we just have to solve, and might take the pressure off of us to solve that problem, and I don't know that that's a good thing.
And to just pro your con or con your pro. I think all of the changes that we're contemplating putting into statutes this year are likely, like, there will need to be time for administrative changes to take hold. And so there's sort of the reality that there's only so fast that the policy is going to be able to be implemented. And so what do we do in the interim time?
Since we're sharing our thoughts, I just would say that given the uncertainty coming from the federal government at this particular moment, I can't fathom using reserve money at this juncture. There's too much uncertainty and really gives me pause to even contemplate that.
What do you mean by using reserve?
Using,
$77 million?
yeah,
Oh, the general fund transfer.
yeah, to buy down.
So if I may, to Senator Gulick's point, I think what I heard you say is you would actually support putting money aside for a reserve to address that uncertainty in the coming year, so that when we're back here next January, we have $30 million that we can then use like we used the $13 million last year. Is that correct, Senator Gulick?
Thank you for fleshing out my comments a little bit more. Yes, thank you. I think any amount we can put aside for whatever's coming at us would be wise.
Just to clarify and then a comment. Do you want to put the full 77 million or just the 30 million that Senator Chip just mentioned?
I mean, me personally, if I were queen, I would take all of it. I would take all of it and keep it for what's coming.
Okay. It's hard to totally wrap my head around this without knowing what we're going to do, or if we're going to do anything, or how we're going to handle the sort of bigger long-term picture, because I think it's related, and what we do this year impacts what we're going to do. So it's hard for me to separate the two of them, although I understand that this is a sort of annual exercise that we kind of have to do. I'm wondering, Julia, if you have, I think you were working on some kind of analysis of what, with the tax credit and that 150 million that we use, and how that, if we do it at all or don't, do part of it, and the income levels and all the ways you can mess around with it. Do you have that done? Because that would impact how I feel about this.
Yes, and I did present some of that analysis to Ways and Means, and I believe I'm on your committee's agenda to present either that analysis either this week or next week, depending on, I think, crossover crunch time.
Okay.
An unexpected bill today.
Okay, because I think that I'm not sure that the way that we're doing the tax credit now is the most efficient use of that money, and it seems to me that that's really relevant to what we do here. And so without having seen it, you and I have talked about it a little bit, but without having seen it and know what the bottom lines are, it's hard for me to pick one of these and say, oh, this is the best option, because there are so many other factors. And then there are also other ideas that are floating around that are not on here at all. I mean, there's a ton of ideas on here, I'm not saying.
Put more ideas in the mix.
Pardon me?
More ideas in the mix, the better.
Well, I mean, I think there's some talk about, do we do some kind of income tax surcharge and as a way of creating revenue, or balancing out the income progressivity distribution of property taxes. Putting a surcharge at the higher levels and sort of adding more income tax into the mix. I know that not all of my colleagues at the table would love that, but that's certainly something has been mentioned, and there hasn't been I haven't seen a lot of analysis about it, and that would also play into the mix, because if we can generate revenue, then maybe there's not as necessary for the transfer, or we could use the transfer for something else. I mean, there are just so many other factors that this feels a little bit incomplete, but.
I think that any changes we can make to the property tax credit system and the homestead exemption is certainly not going to be able to be fully realized by July 1st. So it's, again, I think like we are probably stuck with current law for this upcoming year. And so we're sort of working with that. One of the things that I think about in the context of the reserve is 2 years ago, we put aside what felt like a significant reserve to weather a transition, and it was like pebbles.
Yeah.
And so that's one of my sort of, I have some degree of nervousness about creating a reserve that might wind up, you know, drops in an ocean that we could have spent very usefully in a current year. But yeah, I think Representative Odie was something then back and then Feltus.
I would be really cautious about any kind of income tax increase to solve this problem, because I think that, you know, when an economy is strong, you really shouldn't go to taxing more, I think. And when you need to have some taxing capacity set aside for a recession or a downturn in the economy. And that is what we may be facing on the federal level. So I think that we should not tap into additional revenue sources for this at this time for this reason.
In a more holistic look at this, I mean, we're talking about FY 26, 27, 28, maybe even beyond that. And I think we really need to also understand what's going on in the general fund right now. There are base monies in the general fund this year that are being used for one-time expenses, which is, it's a good problem to have. You know, usually it's kind of tempted to go the other way. So I think understanding the quantities of those base amounts and what it looks like going forward would be very helpful.
My comment was that generally I like reserve funds when we have extra revenue, but we don't have extra revenue. I'm not in favor of creating additional reserve funds just to have it for next year. I think it leaves us, unfortunately, an excuse to not do some really hard work this year to cut down that top line in terms of education spending. We need to really do that.
This is a question for Julia. So when we were talking about the yield and the yield that most school districts use in order to present their budget, on your education outlook that you have here, is the December 1st letter the most recent thing that was published, or is it guidance that was updated since then for the school districts? I know that's...
I don't know.
Okay.
I would defer to Chelsea and Sue's opinion on that. I will say that just in terms of just the general process, you know, I'm coming in here with all of you every couple of weeks and publishing an outlook that has a number of yields. So based off of all of these different modeling scenarios, right now we're looking at 5 different yields that could be used to calculate a tax rate. I don't personally, nor does anyone at JFO, issue guidance to school districts in terms of what yields they should be using, because I don't know what you will all decide to do.
Yeah, the reason I asked is just, again, trying to match up with voter expectations of what they thought they were voting on and what their tax bill is going to be. And are we going to use one-time monies to provide them with a tax bill that's lower than that, which is nice, but maybe unnecessary. So it's just trying to figure out where we should be and where we need to be. So that's what I was trying to get to.
Just to clarify for Rep. Odie, when I was mentioning the proposal that's on the table, it's not mine necessarily, about income taxes as a surcharge. It's not in order to increase revenue, it's in order to decrease taxes in other ways. So it would be, I think the proposal would be an offsetting thing, so not to totally have more revenue, but to have the same revenue from different sources. But and to Rep. Feltus's comment about the reserves, I'm just curious if we're gonna weather a transition of our education funding system, we're gonna need reserves in order to help that transition. Any transition costs money, costs a lot of money, in fact. And so I'm wondering if we don't have a reserve fund, how are we gonna pay for the transition? That, I think that we would be super short-sighted to not have some kind of reserve funds to pay for a transition, because transitions are wicked expensive.
That's true, it produces cliffs. I think that's what you would be referring to. And I think we're gonna have to face up to what those cliffs might be and determine how to handle them.
So I guess a lot of my thinking is I want to know more from our policy committees how likely this transition is, like it maybe bears out, what the timeline is going to look like, and that might inform the decision about this. The other thing, this is a relatively new person question. I remember last spring the revenue update that came out where then there was additional monies that made it more comfortable to buy the rate down. Do we anticipate a revenue update in the next month or two? No.
No, so in terms of process, everything that's included in here is reflective of the January consensus forecast. So it's a way to make sure that everyone's using the same information to come to their policy choices. I don't know when you're referencing a revenue update from last year. Perhaps it was something on the general fund side of things and looking at more general fund revenue being available for some reason for the one-time transfer to the education fund?
Yeah, I think once you get to May or whatever, but once you get to the end of the fiscal year, if revenues have come in ahead of forecasts, what the appropriation committee did is set up a waterfall, and there were money for floods and there was money to buy down the tax rate. But that, you have to wait until all the books are cleared. I know towns complained that they hadn't gotten a check. And but we are bound, because we got ourselves into trouble in the 90s by everybody saying, well, I think we'll have more, or I think we'll have less. Usually we think we'll have more. And we have had emergency meetings. I believe during COVID, we had an emergency update. If the stock market crashes, we will probably have, an emergency update and a new revenue forecast. But that's a formal process with the economists. It's not us.
Yeah, and two other things that I think happened. So the budgets were sort of steadily coming in lower throughout the course of last year. I think the analysis related to the short-term rental surcharge shifted slightly between chambers. And the appropriations in the budget that were originally intended as one-time appropriations got moved to the waterfall list so that this transfer could be an appropriation itself and not but no, I don't think any magic good news is coming. I might. Any other questions for Julia? Okay, thank you very much, Julia. Really appreciate it. Ways and Means, we're gonna talk about this again soon. And we're gonna switch gears slightly. Megan Roy, the chair of the Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont, who has been doing some absolutely exemplary work herding some cats in an ever-changing environment, has joined us. And Megan, I'm really glad you're here with us and would love to hear an update from you on your work, and maybe we can offer some thoughts on how we see your work fitting into our work as we move forward.
Great. Thank you. And thank you everyone. For the record, I am Megan Roy. I coordinate the school leadership program at St. Michael's College, but I'm here in my capacity as chair of the Commission on the Future of Public Education. And again, appreciate the opportunity to sort of provide updates. I know you're running a bit behind. I will try to sort of hit highlights that feel most relevant. And I think that question that you posed is an important one to sort of get to. So since the last time I joined each of your committees back in January, the Commission's really been trying to navigate a path forward that will allow us to be most useful to the legislature. You're quite familiar with our charge, but it is to study the provision of education in Vermont and make recommendations for a statewide vision for our system to ensure that all students are afforded substantially equal educational opportunities in an efficient, sustainable, and stable education system. But I would say that since the sharing of the administration's proposal and then the ensuing discussions, it's been challenging for the Commission to find its way forward. The administration's proposal is not the Commission's proposal, and we weren't formally charged with responding to that. And yet, as the body convened to study the provision of public education, we are asking ourselves, should we respond to that proposal or continue the deep policy work that this General Assembly asked us to do? And answering that question continues to be a challenge, but our goal is to move forward and be constructive to the legislature. So the steering group, who is responsible for coordinating the work plan of the Commission, believes it's important to keep moving forward. And we continue to organize our discussions in those three areas that by now you're familiar with: governance, funding, and quality. Those came out in our preliminary report. And so we've been organizing our agendas so that we can develop questions, considerations, recommendations when appropriate. And this also allows us to respond to active policy proposals and continue to move our own work forward. You will see in just what I share today that we are trying to do, in a sense, we're trying to do both of those things. And I would also just add that, officially we're not scheduled to deliver a report until December, but obviously we think it's important to communicate our work in real time because you are doing your work in real time. So some of that will come in the form of updates like this. It also could result in more formal either issue briefs, could include preliminary recommendations. We'll sort of take that as it comes. So what I would like to do is summarize our last two meetings. And in February, because at least the chairs of your committees did receive an update from the February meeting, I will try to just highlight parts of it that feel particularly relevant to your committees. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we've done and what we're about to do at our next meeting. Our discussions have been pretty wide-ranging, so they are built to surround a certain pillar, and then they sort of expand from there, which is not surprising because all of the areas that we've identified are interconnected. So we organize our conversations to organize ourselves, and they touch, all three areas touch themselves. So what I thought was relevant, particularly for your committees, is that the February meeting in particular, the agenda topic was on funding, and specifically, we wanted to surface questions, concerns, and considerations for the legislature as it considers the merits of a transition to a foundation formula. Members reflected on testimony that you all have seen and other relevant committees, and here are some themes that emerged from that discussion. And again, I'm summarizing themes because we have not generated an official report with recommendations, but these still feel relevant to your committees. First, there's concern on the part of the Commission that the sufficiency of the base amount in the administration's proposal is insufficient. It's very clear when considering whether or not a foundation formula is a good idea. Everything starts with whether or not the calculation of the base amount is sufficient. An inadequate base amount doesn't provide the resources needed for schools to meet students. And so the discussion at the Commission is concerned about that. So the proposal takes almost $200 million out of Vermont's education system. And the commission is pretty clear that they believe that this magnitude of reductions would impact students. There was also discussion by the commission that there are districts that currently operate at scale, or at least at the scale identified in the PICUS report and other evidence-based practices around district size. And they would face significant reductions if this formula was applied. And so there's some question as to why that makes sense in systems that have achieved scale. There's concern, which is related to the sufficiency of the base amount. There's concern about the fact that the proposal relies only on the evidence-based model to derive that amount. There are more than just one method for developing a base foundation formula amount. I believe you both heard testimony towards that end. And commission members suggest that if the legislature is exploring this, that they should utilize all three of those models. And there's a reference in your written materials to Dr. Colby's testimony. And it's also, the commission talked about it being really important to include a mechanism for the foundation formula to be increased if there is a foundation formula. I'm going to apologize in advance. My lights might turn off because they are, there we go, they turn back on. Sorry about that. It's awkward when it happens. So the commission also talked about cost drivers. Any proposal to adjust funding or even governance won't result in change unless overall cost drivers are addressed. Instead, that reduction of spending will simply impact students. You're going to hear that often because that was talked about a lot by the commission. Cost drivers identified are not a surprise to your committees: healthcare, facilities, tuition, mental health services, and others. Commission members acknowledged, even though our agenda item for that day was funding, that it's hard to assess a funding model that's built on a governance structure that doesn't exist yet, which prompted a discussion about governance. So a couple of themes from that discussion. It's the belief of the commission that changes to governance, regardless of how many districts that ultimately came out of that, really needs to occur prior to the funding formula shift. And that's because the formula modeled in the proposal is based on a 5 different district structure. So it relies on savings that are gained from a movement to that structure. So decreasing funding before making those changes, again, only impacts students. Kind of reiterating, but the commission discussed that the savings reflected are derived from a structure that doesn't exist yet. So the amount of upheaval and disruption to the system that would occur if that proposal were implemented, and there was discussion about whether or not that magnitude of savings is worth, that magnitude of upheaval is worth the tax impact. So talk about upending our education system. And in general, the commission just felt like the magnitude of change involved in the proposal requires more time and contemplation to determine the merits, and then even more time for implementation. They talked about other implementation challenges in the state that have made it difficult for legislation, even legislation that is well-intentioned, from realizing its intent. I will go quickly through these next few. I did just want to say, I understand that the committee discussed this, had this conversation prior to the draft bill coming from the administration. I know there are some revisions in that proposal about choice, but I think it's important for committees to know. Commission members felt like it was impossible at the time to separate that expansion of a school choice in the administration's plan. There's concerns raised about this expansion taking more students out of the public education system at a time when schools are already experiencing enrollment decline. An expansion of choice risks further destabilization, and there are significant equity concerns about who actually accesses school choice within a system and who does not. We had a significant discussion as a commission about quality, which is one of our guiding principles. The impact of the proposal on the quality of instruction. We sort of acknowledge that the administration talks about how their proposal is designed to improve quality, but from the perspective of the commission discussion, Even if a massive governance shift occurred as proposed, that wouldn't necessarily change the delivery of education at the local level. So again, their concern is that the proposal would simply reduce funding with no guarantee of increased quality. So specific to the foundation formula, any discussion of the foundation formula needs to be grounded in the extent to which that amount is calculated to provide the resources necessary for the school to implement quality instructional practices. Members are very concerned, this came up in both our February and March meetings, about the fact that school construction is not addressed in the proposal. Facilities needs are not just a cost driver, although the commission believes they are. They're also intricately connected to any change in delivery model that could occur as part of a redistricting plan. Several commission members shared examples from their organizations where a district might be contemplating the merging of smaller buildings, but can't make those changes without facilities renovations. So the basic infrastructure needs of our system can't be separated.
Megan, you're welcome to rush as much as you want on your own behalf. I know we started with you and we can go later with you if you have more time. I understand if you don't, because you have your own life to live, but you don't need to rush to meet our timeline. And I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier.
No, actually, I appreciate that. I will rush. I do have time. Class does not start until later this evening, so I'm okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I would say, I think it's important to convey, just in general, the commission, you can sort of see the thread of the discussion. And again, I started this by saying we have been challenged with knowing whether or not it's our job to respond or to generate. And I think we're trying to land on doing both when it makes sense. Some commission members did wonder whether or not the commission should take a formal position about the proposal writ large, specifically a position against the proposal. The group did not decide that it was a good idea to take that action. Partially because the February meeting occurred during a state holiday and we were missing a few members, including members of the administration, but also because they felt it was equally important to convey the summary. But this is what the commission felt it was important for the legislature to be aware of. And that really is that the fact that the commission wasn't involved in the development of the proposal makes it really challenging to know how to best serve our work, at least the work that was given to us. And I think it's important for us to get clarity on that. We're trying to create our own clarity as a commission, but we were given a big charge and we've had the ground shift underneath us a little bit about that. I know that there is the perspective that the administration has collaborated with the commission, and I believe good faith attempts have been made, but communicating with the commission is very different than using the commission as a body to run suggestions through. The rollout of the proposal lacks detail, and we understand that detail comes, but it makes it difficult to adequately engage in responding and providing feedback. I think there's frustration from commission members around the rollout of the proposal. And again, commission members sort of feel stuck, unsure whether their job is to provide alternate recommendations, to use that as a base, to continue on its own work. The parallel track really hasn't been productive. The other concern that I think is important, and it's certainly a concern that we are trying to address from a messaging standpoint, at least as a commission, but the messages stated and implied in the administration's proposal are that Vermont needs a complete rebuild of its entire system. And we believe that that message alone degrades our public education system. Commission members voiced concern about messaging that faults Vermont educators, leaders, school boards, and communities for the challenges that we face today. Thoughtful questions are described as defending the status quo, and those who ask those questions are described as misinformed. This denigration further erodes the public education system. Instead, the commission believes that the design of any transformation should build on the strengths of our current system. This was a pretty important message that commission members wanted to convey. The Commission met again on March 3rd, this time with a focus on our governance pillar. Again, we're trying to have these conversations in real time so that you have information from the Commission. We started that discussion with a brainstorm and the guiding question, what are we trying to gain with the creation of scale through a governance change? In other words, if there is a contemplation of changing our governance structure, what are we trying to achieve with that? So that if there are recommendations that come out of it, we can ask ourselves if they achieve what we hope to gain. The conversation was pretty wide-reaching. This part I'm trying to drill down. The most common gains centered around increased operational efficiency and also increased opportunity for students. Can we create that with additional scale? The risks identified, and again, I can certainly share more or answer questions, but these are themes. There's sort of an acknowledgement that a governance change alone does not reduce costs. There has to be a corresponding policy lever for cost containment or addressing cost drivers. And again, this is a repeated theme, but cost containment without addressing those underlying issues of cost drivers and also delivery will only reduce services for students. Governance change and therefore consolidation can't be done without addressing construction and facilities. That was a theme that was pulled out pretty concretely by Commission members. And there are just a number of operational challenges that will require thoughtful analysis. I know business managers have outlined these pretty explicitly, but there include the ones that came up, and there are more, but the merging of collective bargaining agreements, which is related to teacher salary, local engagement. There was a lot of discussion at the Commission around the extent to which local school councils are as effective as they could be around local engagement. So the greatest question I would say that the Commission is discussing is just that broader one of, is upending the current system worth the potential gain for efficiency, and will it realize the increased opportunity it hopes for? During discussion, Commission members made clear that they believe there are steps we can take to improve quality, funding, and governance. The Commission does not wish to maintain the status quo. And I think that's an important message to highlight. The Commission is trying to do this thoughtfully because that is how it believes that good policy is developed, not because they're trying to slow this down so that nothing happens. And sort of our immediate next steps, and it's a pretty important element of this, and again, it goes back to, does the legislature continue to want the Commission to do its work this way? We've been working with Afton Partners, a communication and engagement firm, hired to support our community engagement efforts and to do that in a really equitable way. That contract just began in January, and their first task is to revise the Commission's communication and engagement plan. They have met with the communication and engagement subcommittee to get input on those revisions, and that they will present their revised plan to the full Commission on the 17th. While the revised plan is something that'll be presented in a week, and I don't want to get ahead of that, I do think one element of our subcommittee meeting is important to highlight today. We discussed the importance of utilizing an equity impact assessment during the development of any policy recommendations. Afton Partners shared a tool, but our own Office of Racial Equity in Vermont has a tool. I think you all are familiar with it. Regardless of the method, this real-time analysis of proposals is critical in order to address the Commission's pillar of equity. It's also a way to center voices that are not sitting at our tables as we make recommendations. And the Commission does not believe that this has occurred yet. So we believe that that work is really important, and we also acknowledge that that work takes time. And the question really becomes, will the Commission be allowed the time to do that well? What's clear to the Commission is to do transformative policy work, the approach needs to be recursive. We have to gather data, input, react to that data, reflect on it, adjust our proposal, and repeat the process. This is human-centered design for policy development, and the Commission is poised to do this work if the legislature continues to ask us to do that. And I would just sort of end with a bit of an editorial aside, as a longtime policy observer in this sphere. Public education is one of the few institutions left with an express purpose of serving all students. We don't have wait lists. We don't have entrance criteria based on whether someone's a good fit. We serve all the kids that come through our doors. I also understand that arguably right now, we're not serving all students well. We have a commitment to equity of opportunity, but big disparities in how we provide and fund education. We have schools with a lot of staff and decreasing numbers of students, but we're not organizing ourselves to use that staff in the best way possible. So we know we need strategic and bold changes, to use that someone else's word, to realize that vision. And I say that because I think the commission has, we get a lot of feedback. Right now, we're getting a lot of feedback from the public worried about the proposals on the table and hoping the commission will be able to react and respond. But we also get feedback that we're not moving fast enough. And I think it's important to reiterate that the commission does believe change needs to happen. We want to make sure that it's the right change. And I would just go back to kind of how you kicked it off, which is it would be helpful for the legislature to affirm that it still needs and wants the commission to do this work. I know even something as simple as the legislature gathering input about the future of public education, which is a really important part of your purview, but it's also what our group is charged to do and is trying to do. So that is what I wanted to update you all on. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Megan. I just want to name that for me personally, even sort of in the role as chair, the fact that all of the relevant stakeholders are on the commission means that we can access all of the relevant stakeholders who have now formed stronger relationships with each other and have practice and a framework for discussing policy, that I think it makes it much more easeful for us to be doing this kind of recursive policy work that you described. So even like at this point, I personally, in my role, find that very useful, and I can imagine a much greater role for it in the future. I also just want to reflect on the fact that when Act 60 passed, and I was not here as chair when that happened, I was in fact in college, but these chairs might have actually been in this room at that point. They were. I have been, however, raised up in the legislature on myths of Act 60, and one of them that I understand is that there was a really significant public roadshow, for lack of a better explanation, over the course of years in order to communicate with communities around those transitions, pluses and minuses, et cetera. And so the explicit communications role that you're talking about, not to sell something, but to hear what is needed, where challenges lie, where things need to be solved, real that on-the-ground feedback, I think will be tremendously impactful as we take these next steps. And the last thing that I would share, and I would, welcome the committees also to jump in on this, is that likely a very significant piece of legislation leaving here in, April, May, June, July. The last one's a joke. Sometime this year. Will have implementation dates further in the future, dates certain where more micro decisions need to be made, and a body outside of ourselves will likely need to be involved in that. And the fact that you all are there and likely available for that, again, sort of, to use your word, that recursive work of reporting back to us so we can make those decisions at those dates certain, I imagine to be an essential part of us being able to pass something significant this year. Because there's no way we can make all the decisions this year. We're gonna have to be able to make decisions about decisions this year. So I really appreciate your work and the really significant amount of time a whole lot of very skilled professionals have put into sitting on that, including our some of your comments. I have not made the last two meetings, so you don't disclose.
I just wanted a really quick response to that, and I appreciate that. And, the commission remains willing, so if the legislature were to say, here is the thing we would like you all to respond to or conduct these equity assessments on, or maybe it's more than one thing, but that will only help us organize ourselves and also help you and be productive. So we are trying to navigate through in a way that we feel is useful. We will also take direction, and in fact, that direction would help us.
I think part of the problem is we are the money committees. We aren't making the decision on the governance. And so until some of those, we have the big proposal. But there's committees in both bodies are working, I think, to scale down the big proposal from everything I've heard. And we're waiting to figure out what we're going to be funding and what we're going to fund this year and how we're going to fund it. So we're all kind of in a holding pattern. It took a long time, and we still don't have, at least I haven't heard, a transition plan. How do we move from here to there? And so once we start to get actual proposals from legislative committees, then it will be a lot easier to ask you to give us feedback on something we might actually be considering. Because I don't know that the 9 districts is being seriously considered anywhere.
I guess the number of districts is certainly very much up for debate. It doesn't feel to me yet that we're scaling back proposals. I would describe it more as stretching out proposals into a couple more years.
Yeah, so we're still in a very formative phase here. Just trying to figure out what is the best way to move forward. And how do we scale that and how do we move it forward? And I think I'm coming to the conclusion that we probably aren't going to save a whole lot of money. I think my goal would be to get more control over the increases and at the same time be able to provide a high quality level of education to every student, because we aren't doing that right now. But it's at one level being sold as we're going to save hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know. I know we have to build, and I'm sure we will have to build or repair. We got the school construction bill today in my committee. And on my morning committee, we're working on health insurance. And we know that cost has to get brought under control, not just for the schools, but for everyone. Because if anything, our healthcare system is in as much financial crisis as our education system. And we need to deal with both of them at the same time. And we won't throw housing into the mix, but it's there too. So there are a lot of challenges out there, and to have any group working as a think tank as to what would work at this point, I think would be very helpful to give us input, because we're in our little goldfish bowl.
Representative Berger.
I just want to say thank you, Megan, for all the work that the commission has put in. As a new legislator, tried to get up to speed on a lot of the issues that we're now working on by watching your meetings, over the summer and all the way up until really we got busy here and I didn't have time to do that anymore. I guess my question is really more for the chairs. I wasn't here when the commission was originally tasked with this mission. I just would like to understand better the mechanism for giving them direction. Does that have to be done formally? How does that work to actually sort of shift or give them more guidance on what we would like them to do? Because I do think, as Senator Cummings said, is a very valuable tool or think tank that we have, and I wouldn't want us to move away from it, but I just want to make sure that there's a mechanism to give them clear direction on where we would like them to go.
They have a fairly broad charge, but it is also a specific broad charge. So we can, I don't know if this is an informal atmosphere, but we can offer guidance in this format that I imagine will be taken seriously. And there's probably an edge where we're coming up against their ability to meet their formal deliverables, at which point we would need to revise statute. But both of those things are possible, and I think a balancing act. I imagine that the final education bill will have some changes to their charge, but I think we can do lots before that passes. Does that feel comfortable to you, Megan? Do you want to?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And I would say to the extent that obviously I don't want to put ourselves in a position where we don't meet our legislative requirements. However, our charge is so broad that you helping us prioritize our work in the short term, it's not going to be time wasted. It's going to be connected to something we need to report out on anyway. Some of the things that are more challenging in our timeline is sort of like, we need to go through a formal public comment process according to the legislation that has to kick off on October 1st on proposed language and recommendations. And because we intend to do so much engagement, it would be helpful to have that sort of very concrete timeline adjusted. That's for your future conversation. I would just reiterate, we will and would welcome direction that is more informal, because again, it's going to fit somewhere into the long list of things that we are asked to do anyway. So I don't think in fact, we're spinning our wheels more when we don't have that direction. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Megan. This is Senator Gulick, and that was a great presentation. Really useful and helpful. I want to piggyback on what Senator Cummings said a little bit. We spend the whole day together, and it's wonderful. And in the morning in health and welfare, it's interesting because there are so many correlations between the two systems, but we are contemplating doing the exact thing that we have with the commission. In other words, we are trying to figure out a way to sort of react immediately to healthcare costs while also putting in place a long-term plan with a kind of commission that brings everyone to the table. Hospital executives, the Green Mountain Care Board, the DEVA, all the various agencies, so that they can work together with all of their disparate lenses and interests and so on to come up with a long-term plan for healthcare in Vermont. And I sort of see you as that, sort of a similar kind of body or group that will work on long-term planning. So thank you. I also just wanted to respond briefly, as being in a money committee and not being able to, at least at this point, sort of weigh in on the governance piece. It's hard to do the finances without the governance. But also I'm worried that we're trying to create a financial system based on something that is built on a false premise. It's sort of, we're trying to construct something that is built on a system that, for me, is kind of a non-starter. And one of your questions here was, the commission was not involved in the development of the administration's proposal. I want to know who was. I'm still not clear who was. Like, I went to the Listen and Learn tours, and they were nice, but they were basically just gathering feelings from folks in the public. They weren't data-driven, or they weren't asking us to put together a system based on data and geography and so on and so forth. So I know we're relying on out-of-state consultants. That's obvious to me. But I'm still, I'm so reluctant to spend all of this time and all of this effort on a system that to me is shrouded in mystery, and doesn't seem to be workable for the state of Vermont. That's just my opinion. Thank you for listening. So I guess my point is, I hope we can keep you around. I think you've got work to do for our long-term vision, and I love that we've got all of the stakeholders, or many of the stakeholders around the table. I think that's critically important. And I will leave it at that. Thank you. And let us know how we can help you.
Thank you, Megan. This is kind of a specific comment to one of your concerns. And again, I know you had reiterated that you didn't actually look completely at the formula, but when you're talking about a adjustment in the foundation formula annually, an inflator, there is a proposal that uses an annual adjustment based on the New England economic projections, and I don't know that much about it, but is that, are you familiar with that, and do you think that's not sufficient, or is it sufficient?
Yeah, it's a great question, and here's what I would say, but I would, my caveat is that the detail behind that wasn't available to the commission. So right now I'm basing this on my read of the proposed language. And the first thing that I think is the most obvious around using CPI as the inflator is that CPI doesn't keep pace with our healthcare increases. And if healthcare and staffing is a large percentage of our school budgets and would remain so even under a foundation formula, then that particular inflator, while at least there is an inflator, it doesn't keep pace with other costs that are uncontrolled. So that is a very simple, sort of answer based on that. These are the types of things that we would continue to need to look at, whatever the we is in that statement, commission, the legislature, but that would be my first answer. And the commission talked about it in the context that other states, when switching to foundation formulas, who haven't adequately addressed that, when times get tight, foundation formulas shrink. And frankly, that's actually what prompted the Brigham decision, is because the foundation got low enough that everyone was needing to compensate. Right. So Vermont has experienced this too.
Okay, thank you.
We did have an inflator in place originally in Act 60 until a few years ago. There was a general fund transfer required, and there was an inflator, and I don't remember what it was based on, but it was based on the education kinds of costs. It wasn't just general. So there is one out there that worked for probably 10 years.
And there is a really fun presentation from JFO about various inflators.
But I think you'll find that there is significance, at least across the hall from my room. There was significant consternation during the last economic downturn that everything else in the state was being significantly cut back except education. So it's how do you find that balance, or do you?
Representative two things. The school boards don't, the Vermont School Boards Association testified in the last biennium about changes to how the wording might be regarding negotiating healthcare benefits. And we have not taken that up. So maybe it's something the commission wants to come with a recommendation about. And second of all, since it's not in the hands of the school boards to negotiate this, I understand that they are doing it through the SBA, but that is different from doing it on the local level. So maybe the general fund needs to pick up any more increases in healthcare benefits.
Representative Burkhardt.
If we're just giving sort of our wish list of things that we might like you to focus on, one of the things that I would love more input on from the commission is education quality standards, because I feel like there is so much discussion in our committee and in House Ed about governance and about foundation formula specifically, and I feel like all of that needs to be built on this vision of what education quality means to us. And I've asked that question to a couple people and been told, well, we have education quality standards, but I'm not sure how that's translating into what this new vision is for what we hope for our kids. And I would love that to be filled out by people who are way more knowledgeable and way more on the front lines of education. That's one. And the other one is special education and how we're delivering it. And really both quality and as a cost driver, is there a way that we can be more efficient from a cost perspective and also be delivering better services to kids? Because I think, at least in our local, the 2 school districts that I work with, there are frustrations about both of those things. The cost being an increasing percentage of budgets, and yet families that are receiving those services maybe not feeling like they're getting what they need. And so that's kind of both a policy and a money question. I'm trying to stay as much as I can out of the policy, but those are 2 things that are really top of mind for me.
Sorry, thank you. Follow up. I'm going to follow up on Representative Burkhart regarding EQS, but not just EQS, but all of Title 16 statutes as well as rule. How does this new plan contemplate all of what's already on the books? And because it seems like there'd be a lot of change in terms of rule and statute. So again, in terms of like a laundry list, I'd be curious to know how's that going to be worked out?
Yeah, I appreciate both of those questions. I would say the commission has had a little bit of conversation actually back before the preliminary report, and then frankly dropped the conversation because it became focused on that December short-term report. But it was about, is our ed quality, is our definition of quality in Vermont embedded in the EQS? And many argue that it is, and we didn't really take that conversation as far as we need to at that time. So I think that's helpful feedback. And the piece about special education, with my non-commission hat, I have lots of thoughts about evidence-based practices in special education and ways to deliver those better. And so that's a separate issue, but I would concur that it is part of that picture of both quality and cost drivers.
Thank you for this testimony. I really appreciate the written as well as the verbal, and I really love that you did say multiple times that the commission members are not wishing to maintain the status quo. It seems like we're all at a place where we know we can do things differently and better in Vermont. And I didn't see in your written testimony, but I did hear in your verbal ones, your verbal comments. The importance to me in this conversation is I too am not seeing an obvious way to save $181 million with this new formula. But if we constructed a foundation formula that funded it at their exact same levels with some new governance, these are 3 things that have come to my mind as worthy of continuing this conversation. And I think I heard pieces of it in what you were talking about, and I would just put them on the table for you to consider as a commission, is that I use the opportunities for more consistency and curricular depth and offerings to our middle school and high school kids. I see that opportunity with fewer districts than 119. I also see a smoothing of local appetite for local spending decisions, including new facility bonding. I'm really concerned that right now, kids' access to educational opportunity in the state is more a function of the will of the voters in the community they live in than our desire as a state to provide them equitable access to educational opportunities. And the other one, I had some gut-wrenching experiences with some of the school districts recently in my constituency about staffing cuts that they're having to make, and that they have to apply for other positions in other districts that are hiring, and it's just really difficult. So I'm wondering if with new governance there might be more staffing flexibility for advancement and retention to stay within a more rationally designed district so that there's less having to let people go and having to rehire in another district. I'm wondering if some governance might achieve some of those efficiencies in both staff deployment as well as for advancement opportunities. So I'm not looking at really stating a question at all, just these are 3 things as to why I'm still very open to this conversation, because I see merit in rethinking how we're approaching education in Vermont. But I'll get off my soapbox now.
Oh, I would just say that those 2 threads are that's really the preliminary conversation even that we had in March, which is if done well and carefully, efficiency can be gained. And again, I'm sort of conveying the will of the commission. I don't want to be misquoted as saying the commission believes, but they too agreed that increased opportunity for students and then operational efficiency, and a lot of that can involve increased opportunity for teachers and educators and stability and things like that. So I do think that that's the next layer of conversation. And again, for myself as an individual, I think we can do better within our structures if there are some things that get in our way. And it isn't necessary. It's actually about using our resources better, not necessarily just with a focus on efficiency. I also think efficiency can come when we do a better job for kids, but I think starting with sort of a reduction makes that harder.
Megan, do you feel clear on the questions that the communications consultants will be asking in the field? And if you want more advice about that, when do you need that advice by?
Yeah, so what we are working on right now is the how and the who, and the how those differ in the short term. But very quickly, once we know that, so for example, we're going to do this number of forums and this type of electronic forum and this type of virtual forum and these hand-targeted, once we have that framework, absolutely, if the legislature could say, we would like you to get input on this, this, and this, would be really helpful. Certainly, we have signaled, and we can come up with that, but it would be much more efficient. So in terms of a deadline, as I said, March 17th is largely about the how, and sort of into April, but very quickly after that, once the engagement begins, it would be great to have some concrete things.
That's a lot of time. Thanks. That's great. Okay. Thank you.
If you have the questions sooner, we'll take them whenever you have them.
Well, we've been doing, the speaker's office has been sharing with members various ways to engage with House members, various ways to engage communities in getting feedback. But that's the actual labor of that really sits on the representatives who are doing it. And it's really just an incredible opportunity to have a much more closely facilitated, invited, staffed situation for all of that. So yes, I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I'm looking forward to engaging with that question.
Yep. And I would just say specific to that, I actually received that through my Superintendent's Association channels, not through my official commission. But to the extent, if those are the questions, the commission is trying to launch. So anyway, I just wanted we are happy to connect those dots better, because I would say that one of the things that we hear from the public is that they are confused. What was the listen and learn? What is your meeting? They ask us questions about the governor's proposal that we don't necessarily know the answers to. And I think those layers of communication, we think more is better, but actually I think sometimes it's confusing. So sorry, I didn't mean to throw that in there at the end, but.
No, I totally agree. There's no way for the public to I can't fathom being outside of these sort of core conversations and being able to track who all of the stakeholders are in any of this and what differentiates one session from another. Figure it out. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. Thanks so much for your time, Megan. And
thanks,
all
everyone.
of your labor. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Bye.